Hello and welcome. I'm Dr. Paul Malgrati, working at the University of Glasgow on a project to rehouse the Bibliography of Scottish Literature in Translation, otherwise known as BOSLIT. BOSLIT is an ambitious venture starting in the 1990s and aiming to record all existing translations of Scottish literary texts in Old World languages. Today, it comprises more than 32,000 entries from the Middle Ages to the present era. In other words, it is an invaluable resource, crucial for the work of many literary scholars, translators, and publishers. Until very recently, BOSLIT's searchable catalogue was hosted by the National Library of Scotland, but due to format issues, it had to go offline in 2018. This is why I'm currently assisting on a project funded by the Royal Society of Edinburgh and led by Professor Kirstine McHugh and Professor Lorna Hughes to create a new home and a new website for BOSLIT at the University of Glasgow. Because the launch of the project coincides with the 250th anniversary of Walter Scott, one of the most widely translated authors in Scottish, European, and world literatures, it seemed only appropriate to bring BOSLIT and Walter Scott together in a little discussion. I'm delighted to be currently in the company of two experts in the field of Walter Scott studies and of Walter Scott's reception, afterlives, and translation. Professor Anne Rigney, you're Chair of Comparative Literature at the University of Utrecht, and in 2012, you published a very influential book, The Afterlives of Walter Scott, Memory on the Move, with Oxford University Press. Professor Murray Pittock, you're Bradley Chair of English Literature at the University of Glasgow, and in 2014, you co-edited a collection of essays on the reception of Sir Walter Scott in Europe, parts of which drew heavily on BOSLIT. Anne and Murray, I have a few short, simple questions to ask you to make us think a little bit about the influence of Walter Scott, about the importance of translation in Scott's afterlife, and more specifically, about the significance of BOSLIT as a resource for scholars and for the wider public. But first of all, I wanted to ask you a more straightforward kind of question to get us started. Which, in your opinion, was the most influential translation of Scott? Anne, would you like to start, maybe?
I think there's no doubt in my mind that the French translator of Walter Scott was the most important, and I think Murray will concur with this. Dufaux-Compré, Auguste Jean-Baptiste Dufaux-Compré, was really a very, very important mediator between Scott and France, and because of that also a mediator between Scott and Europe, since we have to realize that in the first half of the 19th century, French, in fact, was probably a more important language of culture on the European continent than English was. Scott's works were almost immediately translated into French, so that it became almost like a hotline to the continent.
Thanks, Anne. Murray, would you agree with this as well?
Dufaux-Compré is my choice. I think that there are a number of things to say. One of them is that he was extremely important for French history because he presented and did significant mistranslation in the process. He presented Scott in terms of Stuarts against Covenanters and Presbyterians, always. So because he wanted to make a direct link between the fate of Charles I and the fate of Louis XVI. And so it was a translation, a custom of translation that was subtly shifted to make the issues of religion and republicanism to the foreground. And of course, it was very influential in a number of respects. I mean, Balzac's Le Chien in 1829 is very directly related to Dufaux-Compré's translations. But I think the important thing, the thing that makes him central is more than the French dimension, because he was the basis, as Anne was suggesting, for translations elsewhere. And people who read De Faucompré, Pushkin, Manzoni, and Mickiewicz among them, were to the forefront of European nationalism in the 19th century. And they experienced Scott through De Faucompré's translations, as did, because of the particular position of France among genteel Russian society, Russian writers and translators, Gogol and Pushkin chief among them. But I think actually that De Faucompré's interpretation of Scott's peasantry, which is much more smoothed out than Scott's very closely observed and highly with their highly developed sociolinguistic markers, it was actually influential on Tolstoy's presentation of the mystique of the Russian peasantry in the latter stages of War and Peace. And so actually De Faucompré shares with Scott, in a sense, pole position for Scott's influence on continental literature.
That's fascinating. I actually have a Rob Roy translation of De Faucompré here. I'm currently based in France at my mom and dad's house. So there we go. My mom's just been reading this. It's a very twee kind of cover that we have, very much in the 1960s French style. But yes, there we go. So thanks very much for these first insights into the De Faucompré, the first French translation of Scott, very influential indeed. Now, if we try and take a step back more broadly, how come Walter Scott became such a translation success in the Romantic era, do you think? Is there a specific background or context to that? And perhaps if you want to start.
That question, of course, comes back to why Scott? And the question could, first of all, of course, be asked in the English-speaking world, why Scott? And in many ways, the answer to his, the explanation of his success in the English-speaking world coincides with that of his success elsewhere. I mean, he brought a completely new product, as it were, into the cultural field. First of all, as a poet, but I think if we're looking at the translations, I think we're really looking at the importance of the novels. So what he does is he writes about history in a way which nobody else had done before, by combining a sense of history as well-researched, documented. He combined that sense of history with romance, with all of the thrill of storytelling, of turning the past from just simply being a sequence of events into a plot with a beginning, middle, and end, with characters, with color, with location. It's hard nowadays to think of a world without Scott. But if you go back to the 18th century and you look at what was available, we're not finding anything of this storied version of history at that time. So Scott brings something really new, incredibly original, and they're very powerful. Now, of course, he didn't take it out of nowhere. So in that sense, he's not totally religion. He's originally building on work also done by women novelists in the romance genre, in the national tale model. But Scott somehow brought it together. And I think he, in terms of its resonance in continental Europe, of course, he was playing in to a new interest in things Scottish, which of course had come with Ossian in the late 18th century. So Scotland was in the air, as it were. So then you have this Scottish writer with these wonderful tales, which gave colour to the past, brought it alive. So I think if we think about the Middle Ages or the 18th century as being full of colour, rather than being black and white, it has to do with the power, the colour of Scott's writing. So I think he just had something so immensely new to offer at a time, of course, when people were looking for stories about the nation. This is the beginning of this is the Napoleonic period, the post-Napoleonic period, with a new sense of Europe, the Europe of the nations, a Europe which is going to be based on Europe looking for new types of identity construction. And so we have this novelist who's beginning to say, yes, you can find your identity in history, in a collective history, which is not just that of a history in an abstract way, but one which clearly speaks to the public at large. So I think we see him falling, as it were, his seed fell onto very fertile earth in post-Napoleonic Europe.
That's so interesting. Thanks very much. And Murray, would you like to add a few things?
I think that I'd be glad to do that. Yes. So unsurprisingly, I agree with Anne. This happens a lot. But what I'd want to add is that Scott, although very indebted to Sidney Owenson and Maria Edgeworth and other writers, in terms of his European influence, is much more the child of Ossian than he probably personally would have been comfortable with. And then I'd just like to draw a particular French connection, which is, my suspicion is that Napoleon's enthusiasm for Ossian was born out of his Corsican background and out of the use of Corsica as an ancient heroic society, which prevailed in much 18th century discourse, and that Scott was initially received into a Napoleonic world. He was first translated into French, not by de Villepin, in 1813, and in that world was the world of Girardet's Ossian receiving the ghosts of the fallen French heroes. It was a world of the Académie Celtique. It was a world where Napoleon's Celticism, often marginalized in current accounts, it was actually quite central, and that was really important. Secondarily, he was received into a world where a Hadarian world, where the voices of the people in their songs, where the Grimm brothers' collections of the folk and fairy tales, the German peasantry, were marks of national authenticity. And he provided the voices of the people in their songs, but in a fully historicized context. He also helped to drive the emergence of subaltern nationalities, particularly, and I'm not just particular, these are two examples, the Polish case and the Transylvanian case, the latter of which didn't get resolved. And indeed, if one listens to people in Hungary now talking about the losses of the crown of St. Stephen for the Treaty of Versailles Trianon, I wonder what the Transylvanians never look as if they'll get the issues adequately resolved. But anyway, they were very much engaged with Scott. And one of the things there was that while Scott wrote in a paradigm of stadial history, Scottish Enlightenment stadial history, fundamentally a Robertsonian paradigm, with a sentimental attachment to the past combined with the superiority of the present and future. That paradigm, which Scott himself stretched a bit, it has to be said, in quite a few books, wasn't apparent to the non-Anglophone reader in a non-British imperial context. And so in European countries, Scott actually seemed to be a voice for the subaltern nationality in a way that simply wasn't nearly so apparent in England or Australia, or dare I even say it, Ireland. But that's how it was interpreted in 19th century Europe. And those different aspects of language, aspects of Celtic and Ossianic obsession, and aspects of emerging nationalism in a context where Scott had given it much of its language, they made a perfect storm for the acceptance and promotion of Scott's influence throughout the continent.
Thanks very much. Well, what a colourful picture we're getting here already. So interesting. Thanks to you both. So we spoke a bit about Walter Scott, and now let's perhaps talk a little bit about BOSLIT as well, and especially the importance of BOSLIT in your own research work. Murray and Anne, how helpful was BOSLIT, the Bibliography of Scottish Literature and Translation, in your work, and how did you incorporate it in your research? Murray, do you want to make a start on this?
certainly. What I would just say is that BOSLIT, I mean, there are a lot of online resources in the world, and many of them are trumpeted abroad. BOSLIT is one of the most important online resources for Scottish literature in existence. And like many things in Scotland, which are really important, people are not sufficiently aware of its importance or have done enough with it, because within BOSLIT, there is a huge resource for quite a large number of research projects, ones which go far beyond the two collections I've edited in the Reception of Scott, the Reception of Burns in Europe, which could look at national receptions and connections, could look at the speed and nature of spread, can relate different authors to each other, can relate them to national histories and national movements, can relate them to the creation of national epics. I mean, to talk about one of the most important publications of European Romanticism in the last few years, Jip Leerson's Encyclopedia of Romantic Nationalism in Europe, which came out 3 years ago. That is an enormously powerful work, but in quite a number of places, one could see how, had Scottish scholars addressed some of the issues in BOSLIT in more detail, there was yet more to be said. So that's what I would say about BOSLIT, is that there is nothing like it as a starting point for understanding the global footprint of Scottish writing. Thank you, Murray. Anne?
One of the things that we have been talking about is the spread, the procreativity of literature outside the place where it was produced, and in that regard, I think BOSLIT is an amazing tool for beginning to track the dissemination and the uptake of books elsewhere. And you asked about BOSLIT in my own work. When I was studying the afterlives of Walter Scott, it was, of course, extremely interesting to see the uneven flows of his work across Europe. I mean, we talk so far about Scott as a single unit, but of course he wrote many different novels about different topics. And it was fascinating for me to see which books were translated in which countries. And it was, for example, very interesting, but not in a sense surprising, to see that the Talisman is translated into Arabic early in the 20th century, if I remember that correctly. And so, whereas other books have a strong uptake elsewhere. I mean, Ivanhoe, which for me remains, I think, the most important work of the narrative of the last 200 years in terms of its global influence. Ivanhoe has been translated in the most unexpected places, and even quite recently. I have at home quite a little collection of Chinese translations of Ivanhoe, and you'll find them in BOSLIT. And so it was extremely interesting to look through BOSLIT to see what books were people in Japan interested in, what books were they interested in China. And I have to say that Ivanhoe was in fact the one which seemed to appeal most in the Far East, and probably linked to the feudal framework in which it works. Because what we see through by examining translations and the pattern of dissemination of translations, we see resonances between different cultures, right? So reception is not just an even process. It depends on where books arrive and the filters which are in place. So I think an instrument like BOSLIT allows one, gives incredibly interesting data to study these patterns, this uneven dissemination, and to begin to understand a bit better, not just the extraordinary outreach of Scottish literature, which I think is extremely clear when you begin to look at BOSLIT, but also I think that as a case study gives really valuable data to begin to understand more generally these patterns of uneven patterns of dissemination. So I hope in the coming years this will be even further developed in a way that we can look at how books move across time and space using the case of Scottish literature.
Thank you, Anne. Yeah, it's very interesting, especially in terms of the concrete impact then that this resource that is BOSLIT can make on research and what research can say in here, especially about Walter Scott's dissemination. You both have started to answer a bit about this, obviously, but I would just like perhaps to hear a few words about what you think of the current project that we're working on at the University of Glasgow, trying to rescue BOSLIT, to give it a new home. Is this a development that you welcome? Is that how important is that mission to rescue BOSLIT? Just to finish, would you have a few thoughts on that? Murray, perhaps?
Well, I think it's absolutely outrageous that BOSLIT's offline, to be honest. So I'm always going to say it's rather like the Irish in Europe project at Maynooth, which is also now offline. It's just, these things shouldn't be offline. And bringing BOSLIT back under the wing of the University of Glasgow, whether that's the Centre for Robert Burns Studies or elsewhere, that's very, very important because it will come to be used more. And as the Scottish government opens more hubs across the world, the international footprint of Scottish culture will be an increasing dimension of the way in which we understand Scotland. We've only recently been understanding, I think, the scope of the Burns Supper and the extent to which Burns Suppers globally, and you may know a little bit about this, Paul, the extent Burns Suppers globally have an enormous impact on the vision and the understanding of Scotland in the imaginary of the countries in which they're received and sometimes co-created and designed. This is something which there is still far too little knowledge of, and BOSLIT is the single most important literary tool to understand the intersection between text, chronotope, and imaginary, which Anne has so clearly pointed out as the important aspects of opportunities that arise from work on BOSLIT. So absolutely, completely in favor of the maintenance of BOSLIT. Just to say, in the days when BOSLIT was still running, there was a lot of anxiety about updating it. And of course, it does need to be updated. But actually, even 10-year out-of-date BOSLIT is infinitely better than what we now have. So please get it up first, and then we'll see about funding updating.
We'll work on that. Thanks, Murray. And Anne, maybe a few conclusive words as well.
I totally concur with Murray on the importance of BOSLIT being available. I mean, it's already shown what made evidence the number of translations which are out there. So I really hope that in the coming years it will be not just maintained but also further developed, using, I think, many of the new tools which are there with digital, from digital humanities, which would allow one actually to affect visualizations of these global spreads of Scottish literature. So I think there's a real opportunity there to using this data to make it available and to link it to other databases. And in that regard, since I have a comparative perspective and not just a Scottish perspective, I would also see its value also in translation studies, in providing a resource for those who are approaching the study of translation from the perspective of the sort of geopolitical spread, but also in providing a starting point for the real examination of the different patterns of appropriation. We mentioned that at the beginning in terms of French appropriation of Scotland in a particular way. We could use this as a resource to begin to have much more studies of this type of comparative studies of different forms of appropriation. So I really hope it will also, as it were, network with other databases within the frame of translation studies, because I think there's a real opportunity there.
Brilliant. Well, Professor Anne Rigney, Professor Murray Pittock, thanks very much for your insights and your comments. I think this was just a tiny little taster of the great depth and wealth of scholarship that can be found in all the work you've been doing over the years. BOSLIT has had a vivid past. It was built by the patience and efforts of many experts and volunteers. It has served research well so far. So We'll take your advice on board and we'll make sure that its future as a resource, as a treasure trove, shines just as bright. I hope you enjoyed this short interview. Stay tuned in the next few months and years as we go ahead with our BOSLIT project. Thanks very much to Anne and Murray. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Cheers. Thanks so much.